we want to say that compared to 3 years ago, the banks are much better than they were, and they're continuing to improve. But, and you'll hear that but a few times in my conversation, we have to address some real constraints that are going on in the banking sector. As really Tom said, we're delighted to be in Houston. Houston is the best banking market in the United States. That's why there are a lot of banks in Houston. There are actually over 100 banks doing business in Houston in 1,500 locations around our city. That's from the very largest, actually the largest, on down to some very small banks. Banks from the United States, banks from Europe, banks from Asia, all doing business here in our city. And that doesn't include credit unions and shadow banking businesses. There are $137 billion in deposits in Houston and about $100 billion in loans in Houston. Let me discuss how that's broken up a little bit. There are three too big to fail banks that are headquartered in New York, California, and North Carolina that control 60% of our market. Overall, 3/4 of our market is controlled by banks that are not headquartered in our city. That leaves about $25 billion of lending for banks that are at least technically headquartered here. I say technically because one of those banks really reports to Salt Lake, and another one reports to El Campo. So if you really look at the banks that are headquartered right here, there's about $10 billion of lending capacity in those banks. And there's 40 of them, and we're the largest. So happy about that. So how are the banks doing? Well, much better. More capital. As it is mentioned earlier, we've seen a nice improvement in banks' ability to raise capital. They really were up about 2% in the last quarter. And believe it or not, the bank capital ratios are at an all-time high. The all-time high of capital ratios for banks. Deposits are increasing. We saw deposits grow almost 2% in the last quarter. And that continues to reflect the liquidity that my other associates talked about. Good news is problem loans are declining. Tom's chart showed that. They were down 6.5% in the last quarter. And there have been 5 consecutive quarters of declines in problem loans for banks, down 22% from their peak. And there are fewer problem banks. For the first time since the third quarter of 2006, problem banks, the number of problem banks declined. And so that's good news. But, I said you'd hear that a few times. Revenues are falling. They were down almost 2% last quarter. And that's a result of Washington cutting fees and a result of the constraints on people wanting to borrow. There's a lack of demand. Now, we did see loans increase a little bit last quarter, which is actually the first time that that's happened since the second quarter of '06. But only half the banks in the United States and about half the banks in Houston showed loan growth. So the other half actually had negative loan growth. Lower interest rates that are good, but they're squeezing margins in banks and causing earnings restrictions. And compliance costs are driving overall costs much higher. Speaking of compliance, is there more trouble ahead? there's a huge Washington-created burden. Just yesterday, or the day before now, the government sued large banks with regard to their mortgage practices. Maybe they deserved it, but if you want to encourage lending, you don't go out and sue the banks at this point in time. Dodd-Frank was enacted. There are 1,800 pages of final rules and regulations that have been passed. There are 3,000 pages of rules and regulations proposed, and they're just getting warmed up. They've created the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which hasn't started up yet, but will make Sheriff Justice here look like a pussycat. And since the beginning of 2010, Encore Bank has implemented 35 new rules and regulations governing how we make loans and transact business. So these constraints are very significant, and are banks lending? Well, yes, but, and I think that's the key to all of this, if you want a land loan, borrow for land, I think you're out of luck. There are really almost no land loans available from banks. If you want a construction and development loan, there are a few available. Banks will do them, but it's very, very little bit. Banks are not willing to lend because we have a regulatory constraint. We can't make construction and development loans in excess of 100% of our regulatory capital. So that's a constraint. Commercial real estate loans, as Tom mentioned, banks are lending. We're lending in commercial real estate area, but we're also constrained there to 300% of our capital. And that's a limit that a lot of banks are actually running up against. Good news is for us, in both of those categories, we can sort of double the portfolios and still be within the constraints. Mortgage loans. We like to make mortgage loans. We'd love to make everybody in this room a mortgage loan. But the regulatory hurdles to getting a mortgage these days are very, very high. It's very difficult. And if any of you have done it recently, you know it is very difficult task and is constraining lenders in terms of mortgages. Commercial and industrial loans, the regulators have not put any constraints on those loans, so guess what? There's a bit of a feeding frenzy for commercial and industrial loans. We would very much like to make commercial and industrial loans, and if you're out there and want some, let us know. So what's a banker to do, or what's a borrower to do? The key, I believe, is to build a relationship with the bank. And how do you do that? Well, first of all, you open up a checking account. Have a deposit relationship with your bank. And then you go visit your banker. You go visit them when you don't need anything. It's the best time to build the relationship. Sit down, talk about your business, tell them about what's going on in your business. Give your banker lots of data. Bankers love data. Give them industry data. Show them what's going on in your industry. You might want to suggest that the banker takes a field trip. The weather's gotten a lot better. Bankers like to go out and get out of the office and go out and see your operation. That's important to help build a relationship. More importantly, you want to meet senior management at the bank. It's important that you know who the key people are in the bank, and especially you want to know the directors of the bank. That really helps. I can tell you, when Chuck Jeunesse or one of my directors calls me and says, I got somebody you ought to go see, well, sure enough, that person gets seen, and a lot of attention is paid to that person to try to see if we can help them out. And at the end of the day, we want to have a relationship and be part of our borrower's situation. because we're here in Houston, and you want to bank with people you know. So when you run into them, like if you run into me in the supermarket over at Rice there, I'm going to be not running to the dairy aisle to hide because we didn't do something right. If you're dealing with people you know and see in town, it makes a big difference in terms of getting accomplished what you want to get accomplished. So in summation, I would say in the 40 years I've been in banking, we are in a position to want to make loans as much as, and have the capacity to make loans as much as we've ever, and over that 40-year period. At the same time, in all of my 40 years of banking, I've never seen such constraints on bankers in terms of the ability to get the job done. And so it is a very difficult environment to accomplish something. And so as a borrower and your banker need to work together to help you accomplish your goals.